Welcome back to Hidden Faith, and if you're returning to the channel, it's good to have you here again. If this is your first time watching, this channel looks at belief systems as they actually formed, not as they are later polished and presented, and we do that slowly, carefully, and without drama. Today's topic is the Bible, but not the version most people imagine. Not a single book that arrived complete and settled. Not a finished object that dropped into history fully formed. To understand this story, we need to replace that image with a more accurate one. Think of a library, not a book. In the first centuries of Christianity, communities across different regions produced many writings. Letters circulated between groups. Teachings were written down for local use. Stories about Jesus were told in different ways, for different audiences, with different priorities. There was no master list yet, and there was no final agreement on what mattered most. Some texts describe Jesus as a divine figure who defeated death. Others presented him as a teacher who revealed insight meant to awaken the listener. Some focused on trust and faith. Others emphasized discipline, moral practice, or inner knowledge. These differences were not fringe ideas at the time. They were part of early Christian life. So the real question is not why some books were forbidden or hidden. The more important question is how one set of writings became central while others slowly fell away. Selection came before exclusion, and structure came before authority. Popular culture often frames this story as a secret locked away by power, lost gospels, dangerous truths, hidden knowledge buried on purpose. That framing is simple, but it misses what actually happened. The formation of the biblical canon was slow, uneven, and shaped by practical needs. Communities needed shared texts to teach, to organize, and to survive disagreement. Unity did not appear by accident. It was built step by step by drawing lines. In this episode, we will explore how early Christianity was diverse before it became unified. We will look at how texts were evaluated, accepted, or set aside. And we will end with a question that still applies to belief systems today. Does unity always require exclusion? To understand why some Christian texts were later accepted and others were not, we first need to reset our assumptions about what early Christianity actually was. In the first 2 centuries after Jesus, Christianity was not a single religion with a clear structure, fixed leadership, or agreed doctrine. And it did not yet function like the institution people imagine today. There was no central authority that controlled belief across regions. Communities existed in cities spread across the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and parts of the Roman Empire, often separated by distance, language, and culture. Communication was slow, travel was difficult, and local leaders shaped teaching based on their own circumstances and needs. Most people did not experience Christianity through written scripture. Teaching was primarily oral, shared through preaching, storytelling, instruction, and communal practice. Written texts existed, but they circulated unevenly and were copied by hand, which meant access depended on resources, literacy, and local priorities. A community might treasure one text deeply, while another community had never heard of it. Disagreement was normal. Different groups emphasized different aspects of belief, practice, and identity. Some focused on preparing for an imminent end of the world. Others emphasized ethical living within society. Some stressed strict discipline and moral rules, while others focused on spiritual freedom or inner transformation. None of these positions automatically disqualified a group from being considered Christian at the time. It is also important to understand that labels like orthodox and heretical did not yet carry fixed meanings. Those categories only became stable after boundaries were drawn. In the early period, debates happened openly, and positions competed for influence without a final referee to declare a winner. As Christianity spread, practical problems increased. Communities needed consistency in teaching. Leaders needed texts they could rely on. Converts needed clarity about belief and behavior. Without shared reference points, fragmentation became a real risk. This context matters because later decisions about text did not happen in a vacuum. They emerged from a landscape of diversity, uncertainty, and real social pressure. Canon formation was not about controlling ideas at first. It was about creating coherence in a movement that was growing faster than its ability to agree with itself. Before any agreement about Scripture could exist, there had to be agreement about who Jesus was and what his life meant. In the first centuries of Christianity, that agreement did not yet exist. Different communities understood Jesus in different ways, and those differences shaped the text they wrote, shared, and valued. Some Christians understood Jesus primarily as a divine Savior, whose death and resurrection repaired a broken relationship between humanity and God. In this view, salvation came through trust, loyalty, and belief. Faith mattered more than insight, and obedience mattered more than interpretation. Texts that supported this view focused on sacrifice, forgiveness, and communal worship. Other Christians emphasized Jesus as a teacher who revealed hidden truths about reality and the self. In these communities, salvation was not mainly about forgiveness of sin, but about awakening from ignorance. Knowledge mattered. Understanding mattered. Following Jesus meant learning how to see the world differently. Texts linked to these groups often took the form of dialogues, sayings, or symbolic stories rather than narratives of suffering and resurrection. There were also disagreements about the role of the physical world. Some Christians viewed the material world as good but damaged, something to be restored through divine action. Others saw the physical world as a trap or a mistake, created by lower powers and separate from the true spiritual realm. These views led to very different attitudes toward the body, daily life, and authority. A belief system that distrusts the world will produce very different texts than one that seeks to guide people within it. Ideas about salvation followed these divisions. For some, salvation was collective and communal. Belonging to the right community, practicing shared rituals, and remaining faithful were essential. For others, salvation was individual and internal. It depended on personal understanding and inner transformation rather than group membership. These differences affected whether authority rested in leaders, texts, or personal experience. There were also tensions between spirit and law. Some communities believed strict rules were necessary to shape behavior and protect moral order. Others argued that spiritual insight made rigid rules unnecessary or even harmful. These disagreements were not abstract debates. They affected how people lived, who had authority, and how communities held together. It is important to understand that none of these positions were fringe ideas at the time. They existed side by side and often overlapped. A community might share beliefs with several traditions at once. Boundaries were fluid and identities were still forming. This diversity explains why early Christian writing looks fragmented from a modern perspective. Texts were not trying to present a unified system. They were responding to local questions, conflicts, and needs. A text that made perfect sense in one setting could seem dangerous or confusing in another. Only later, when Christianity began to seek unity across regions, did these differences become problems that required resolution. Diversity came first. Selection came later. When people hear about books that were not included in the Bible, they often imagine a hidden collection of complete alternative scriptures meant to replace what we now call the New Testament. That image is misleading. The texts produced by early Christian communities were varied in form, purpose, and ambition, and most of them were never written to compete for a universal role. Some texts were gospels, but even those did not all function the same way. Certain gospels told narrative stories about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Others were collections of sayings, short teachings meant to be remembered, discussed, and applied. Some took the form of conversations between Jesus and his followers, where questions and answers mattered more than historical sequence. These texts reflected how different communities thought learning and authority should work. Many writings were letters. These were usually written to address specific problems in specific communities. They discussed leadership disputes, moral behavior, disagreements about practice, and questions about belief. They were practical documents, not timeless summaries of doctrine. A letter that mattered deeply to one group might have little relevance outside that setting. There were also apocalyptic texts, which used visions and symbolic language to make sense of suffering, persecution, and uncertainty. These writings tried to reassure communities that chaos had meaning and that justice would eventually prevail. Their imagery was powerful, but it was also highly contextual, tied to moments of crisis rather than long-term instruction. Other texts focused on instruction and rules. They explained how communities should organize themselves, how leaders should behave, and how rituals should be performed. These writings show that early Christianity was concerned with structure and discipline long before official institutions existed. It is important to recognize that many of these texts were written for local use. They were copied when needed and ignored when they were not. There was no expectation that every Christian everywhere should read the same material. Value was measured by usefulness, not by status. This diversity of form helps explain later selection. When communities began asking which text could serve a wide and lasting role, many writings simply did not fit that purpose. They were meaningful without being universal. When people imagine the formation of the biblical canon, they often picture a single moment where leaders gathered and decided which books were allowed and which were not. That image is simple, but it is inaccurate. The canon did not appear through one decision, one council, or one authority. It emerged slowly through use, debate, repetition, and necessity. In the early centuries, Christian communities already used certain texts regularly. These texts were read aloud during gatherings, taught to new members, and copied more often than others. Familiarity mattered. A text that shaped daily teaching naturally gained more influence than one that appeared rarely or required special explanation. One important factor was connection to the apostles. Communities valued writings they believed were linked to those who had known Jesus directly or had been close to his earliest followers. This connection did not always mean direct authorship, but it signaled continuity. A text that felt rooted in the earliest generation carried more weight than one that appeared disconnected from that memory. Another factor was consistency with emerging belief. As Christian teaching began to stabilize, communities compared texts against ideas that were becoming widely shared. This process was not purely theoretical. Leaders needed material that supported how they taught about Jesus, salvation, ethics, and communal life. A text that contradicted those teachings created confusion rather than clarity. Widespread usage also mattered. A writing known and valued across many regions had a stronger claim than one known only in a small circle. This was practical. Shared texts helped different communities recognize each other as part of the same movement. A canon helped create a common language across distance. It is important to understand that these criteria were not applied all at once. They developed gradually, and they were debated. Different regions favored different texts for long periods of time. Some writings were accepted early in one place and questioned in another. Disagreement did not stop the process, it shaped it. There was also no sharp boundary at first between texts that were respected and texts that were rejected. Many writings existed in a middle space. They were read privately but not publicly. They were valued for instruction but not used in worship. Over time, that middle space narrowed as communities asked harder questions about authority and consistency. As Christianity grew, the need for stability increased. Larger communities required clearer teaching. Disputes became harder to manage. Leaders needed shared references to resolve disagreement. A fixed set of texts made it easier to teach, correct, and organize believers who no longer shared the same local context. Political and social changes also influenced the process. As Christianity moved from a marginalized movement toward legal recognition, expectations changed. Belief needed definition. Leadership needed structure. Public identity required clarity. A stable canon supported all of these needs. It is also important to note what did not guide canon formation. The process was not driven by a desire to hide information from believers. It was not about eliminating curiosity or silencing honest questions. Most excluded texts were not secret. They were known, discussed, and often debated openly. Selection favored texts that could function across time and place. Writings tied too closely to one community's worldview, one teacher's authority, or one symbolic system struggled to meet that need. What survived was not simply what was powerful, but what was usable. By the 4th century, lists of accepted texts began to look more similar across regions. This similarity did not mean the debates had ended. It meant the movement had reached a point where coherence mattered more than openness. The canon marked a transition from diversity toward stability. Canon formation was not a clean process, and it was not neutral. Choices always reflect priorities, but those priorities were shaped by survival, communication, and shared identity more than by fear of ideas. Understanding this process helps clarify why some texts became central while others did not. The canon was not created to erase diversity. It was created to manage it. Once a shared set of texts began to form, exclusion became unavoidable. This part of the story is often misunderstood because exclusion is usually framed as suppression or fear. In reality, most texts were excluded because they could not function within the kind of community Christianity was becoming. One major issue was radical dualism. Some texts described the world as deeply corrupt or fundamentally evil, created by a lesser or mistaken power. In these writings, the physical body was often treated as a prison rather than a meaningful part of human life. This view conflicted with a Christian message that affirmed creation as damaged but redeemable. A belief system that rejects the world entirely struggles to guide people living ordinary lives within society. Another issue was the emphasis on secret knowledge. Certain texts taught that salvation depended on receiving hidden insight known only to a few. This knowledge was often described as personal, inward, and inaccessible to outsiders. While this approach appealed to individuals seeking deeper meaning, it created problems for a growing community. A religion based on secret access cannot easily teach new members, maintain shared practice, or establish accountability. Authority was also a central concern. Many excluded texts weakened the role of communal leadership by placing spiritual authority entirely within the individual. If insight alone determines truth, then teachers, elders, and shared instruction lose their role. For small groups, this may work. For a large and expanding movement, it creates instability. Disagreements multiply, and there is no clear way to resolve them. Some texts also presented Jesus in ways that conflicted with emerging belief. A Jesus who only appeared human, or who existed solely as a revealer of hidden truth, did not align with teachings about incarnation, suffering, and shared human experience. These differences were not minor details. They affected how people understood ethics, responsibility, and the meaning of daily life. It is important to note that exclusion was rarely about danger in the modern sense. These texts were not removed because they were too powerful or because they threatened to expose a hidden truth. They were excluded because they did not support the kind of religious structure Christianity was building. A faith meant to guide families, communities, and institutions requires shared stories, shared language, and shared authority. There was also a practical dimension. Texts that required advanced interpretation, symbolic decoding, or special instruction were difficult to teach widely. They created dependence on individual interpreters rather than shared understanding. Over time, communities favored writings that could be read publicly, explained clearly, and applied consistently. Orthodoxy in this sense was not only about belief, it was about function. It defined which ideas could support teaching, organization, and continuity. Boundaries were drawn not to erase diversity, but to limit fragmentation. Exclusion did not mean disappearance overnight. Many texts continued to circulate for generations. They were read privately, discussed quietly, and sometimes respected without being authoritative. But as the canon solidified, the space for alternative frameworks narrowed. This process reveals something important. Belief systems do not only preserve ideas, they select for stability. They keep what can be shared widely and set aside what cannot scale. In that sense, exclusion was less about silencing voices and more about choosing a direction. Understanding this helps move the conversation away from conspiracy and toward structure. The question is not why some texts were pushed out. The question is what kind of religion could survive without pushing some ideas aside. After certain texts lost authority, their fate was not uniform. Some disappeared quickly, while others remained in use for centuries. Understanding this process requires separating deliberate suppression from gradual decline, because in most cases, disappearance followed practical patterns rather than intentional erasure. Many early Christian communities simply vanished over time. Economic hardship, persecution, migration, and internal disagreement caused some groups to dissolve. When a community disappeared, its text often disappeared with it. Manuscripts were fragile, expensive to copy, and preserved only if someone continued to value and use them. Other texts declined because they no longer fit the dominant theological framework. As shared belief stabilized, writings that relied on different assumptions became harder to teach and explain. They required too much context or contradicted ideas that had become standard. Over time, they were read less often and copied less frequently. Political change also played a role. When Christianity moved from a persecuted movement to a legally recognized religion, its social function changed. Public teaching, leadership accountability, and institutional stability became more important. Texts that supported unity and discipline gained value. Texts that emphasized private insight or rejected material life lost relevance in public settings. This shift did not require systematic destruction. Neglect was often enough. A text that is not copied does not survive. A text that is not read aloud fades from memory. Preservation followed use, not importance in hindsight. There were moments of active suppression, especially when authorities tried to eliminate teachings they believed caused division. However, these efforts were limited and uneven. They were not part of a single coordinated campaign, and they did not determine the overall outcome on their own. Some texts survived by moving outside official spaces. They were kept in small circles, read privately, or absorbed into other traditions. Their survival was quiet rather than dominant. What we find today often exists because of chance, isolation, or accidental preservation. The disappearance of these writings does not mean they were meaningless. It means they were not aligned with the direction Christianity chose to take. Survival favored texts that supported shared identity over those that explored alternative paths. Understanding this helps explain why rediscovered texts feel shocking today. They are unfamiliar not because they were forbidden knowledge, but because they belong to branches of Christianity that did not become central. In the modern world, excluded Christian texts are often presented as forbidden knowledge, deliberately hidden to protect power. This framing appears in documentaries, novels, and online discussions, and it usually suggests that these writings contain truths too disruptive for institutions to allow. While this idea is compelling, it simplifies a much more complex history. One common misunderstanding is the belief that these texts were actively suppressed because they contradicted official doctrine in a dangerous way. In reality, many of these writings were known, discussed, and even criticized openly by early Christian thinkers. They were not secret documents locked away from believers. Their ideas were part of public debate long before any canon was fixed. Another misconception is that excluded texts represent a single alternative Christianity. This is not accurate. These writings differ widely from each other in tone, belief, and purpose. Some focus on mystical insight. Others emphasize strict discipline. Some are optimistic. Others are deeply pessimistic about the world. Treating them as one hidden tradition ignores their internal disagreements. Popular culture also tends to assume that older or rediscovered texts are automatically more authentic. Age, however, does not equal authority. A text can be ancient and still represent a narrow or late developing perspective. Early Christians were already evaluating writings based on usefulness and coherence, not just date. The fascination with forbidden gospels also reflects modern attitudes toward institutions. Many people today are skeptical of authority and drawn to stories that expose control or deception. These texts become symbols of resistance, even when their original purpose had nothing to do with institutional power. There is also a psychological appeal. Hidden knowledge promises individuality. It suggests that truth belongs to those willing to look deeper, question more, and stand apart. This mirrors the appeal these texts held for some ancient readers as well. The same dynamics repeat across time. Clarifying these misunderstandings does not mean dismissing curiosity. Interest in excluded texts is reasonable and often sincere. The problem arises when fascination replaces careful understanding. When we move past myths, a more interesting picture emerges. These writings are not threats to faith or evidence of a cover-up. They are traces of a diverse and experimental period, preserved unevenly and remembered selectively. Understanding them properly requires patience, context, and restraint. Without those, modern stories say more about our own concerns than about the ancient world. Looking back at how the Christian canon formed tells us less about ancient arguments and more about how belief systems function over time. The process reveals patterns that appear whenever ideas move from small groups into lasting institutions. Belief systems begin with exploration. Early Christianity experimented with meaning, authority, and identity. Different communities tested different answers to the same questions. Who has access to truth? How people change? What holds a group together? At this stage, diversity is a strength because it allows ideas to develop in many directions. As a movement grows, exploration becomes harder to manage. Too many answers create confusion. Without shared references, disagreement can fracture communities. At that point, belief systems begin to simplify. They do not remove all difference, but they limit it. They choose which questions can be asked publicly and which must remain private. Canon formation reflects this shift. It shows how ideas are filtered not only by truth claims, but by function. Texts that support teaching, cooperation, and continuity survive. Texts that emphasize private insight or radical separation struggle to scale beyond small circles. This does not mean the excluded texts were wrong or worthless. It means they served a different purpose. Some explored inner experience, others challenged structure. Those roles are valuable, but they are difficult to institutionalize. The tension between unity and diversity is not unique to Christianity. It appears in political systems, philosophies, and modern organizations. Stability requires limits. Creativity resists them. Every long-lasting system negotiates this tension again and again. Understanding this helps reframe modern debates about belief and authority. The question is not whether institutions corrupt ideas. The question is what ideas can survive without institutions at all. Canon formation reminds us that belief is not only about meaning, it is about transmission. Ideas endure when they can be taught, shared, and remembered by people who do not agree on everything. In that sense, the canon is not just a list of texts. It is a record of choices about what kind of community Christianity decided to become. As we step back from this story, it becomes clear that the formation of the biblical canon was not a simple act of control or suppression. It was a long process shaped by growth, disagreement, and the need for shared direction. Early Christianity did not begin with one voice. It began with many voices speaking at once, often in tension with each other. Unity did not erase that diversity. It narrowed it. Certain ideas were chosen because they could hold communities together across distance, culture, and time. Other ideas were set aside because they pointed in different directions, toward private insight, radical separation, or forms of belief that could not easily be shared. This does not make the excluded texts meaningless. It makes them witnesses to paths not taken. They show us what early Christians were willing to explore, question, and imagine before boundaries hardened. They also remind us that every belief system is shaped as much by what it leaves out as by what it preserves. The question, then, is not whether exclusion happened. It clearly did. The deeper question is whether unity can exist without it. Can a shared identity survive without limits? Can a tradition remain coherent without choosing some voices over others? These questions are not confined to ancient history. They appear wherever people try to build lasting meaning together. They shape religions, cultures, and even modern institutions in ways we often overlook. If this episode helped you see the Bible and early Christianity in a new way, take a moment to support the channel. Like the video if you found it useful. Subscribe to Hidden Faith if you want more episodes like this, and leave a comment telling me which hidden belief, forgotten text, or suppressed tradition you'd like to explore next.